The evening sky had turned a deep purple as the police captain finished up his last community meeting at the precinct. It had been a long but productive day, filled with discussions about improving relationships between law enforcement and local neighborhoods. His suit jacket was draped over his arm as he walked through the parking lot, his tie loosened just a bit after the 3-hour session. The captain had chosen to take his personal car that day, a well-maintained Honda Accord that was starting to show its age. He bought it years ago when he first made detective, and despite his recent promotion, he saw no reason to replace a perfectly good vehicle. The familiar leather seats creaked as he settled in, placing his briefcase filled with community proposals on the passenger seat. As he drove through the quiet streets of Oak Hills, an upscale neighborhood known for its sprawling houses and manicured lawns, his mind wandered to tomorrow's departmental review. His team had prepared a comprehensive presentation on improving police training, focusing especially on community engagement and bias awareness. The presentation included real-world examples and statistics that couldn't be ignored, and he felt confident it would make an impact. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road as he carefully maintained the speed limit. He'd seen too many accidents in his 20 years on the force to take chances, even on empty streets. The clock on his dashboard read 9:45 p.m. when he noticed the flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His heart sank, not from fear, but from a deep, knowing disappointment. He'd been here before, just not in this neighborhood. The captain took a slow, steady breath as he pulled over, making sure to signal properly. Through his side mirror, he could see the patrol car's spotlight flooding his vehicle with harsh white light. He taught countless rookies the proper procedure for traffic stops, and now he found himself running through the same mental checklist from the other side. Interior lights on, hands visible on the steering wheel, engine off, windows down. The cool night air drifted in, carrying with it the distant sound of crickets and the heavy footsteps of the approaching officer. In the mirror, he watched the officer's approach, noting every detail with professional precision. The hand hovering near the holster, the aggressive stance, the flashlight beam that swept across his car's interior with unnecessary thoroughness. 2 decades of experience told him this wasn't a routine traffic stop. This was what he and his team had been working to address in their reform proposals. His police ID and badge were tucked away in his wallet, but he resisted the urge to reach for them immediately. Years of experience had taught him the importance of these first few moments. As another car passed by slowly, rubber humming on asphalt, the captain kept his expression neutral and his hands steady. He wasn't just a police captain right now. He was about to become a teaching moment, though the young officer behind him didn't know it yet. The captain glanced at his phone sitting in the cup holder, remembering the new department policy about recording interactions. With subtle movements, he reached over and activated the recording function, making sure to keep his other hand visible on the wheel. 20 years of service had taught him that documentation wasn't just about protection. It was about progress. Whatever happened next would either be a reminder of how far they still had to go or proof that change was possible. Either way, it would be a story worth telling. Dispatch, Unit 247. Traffic stop on Oak Hill Drive, black Honda Accord. The officer's voice crackled over the radio, breaking the evening quiet. He spoke with the kind of authority that often came with being 3 years into the job. Just enough experience to feel confident, but not enough to know what he didn't know. The beam of his flashlight swept across the car's interior one more time as he approached. The driver sat perfectly still, both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, exactly where they should be. Something about this driver's calm demeanor was different from what the officer usually encountered during late-night stops, but he pushed that thought aside. "Good evening, sir." The officer's voice carried a practiced tone of authority that younger cops often use to mask their nervousness. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" He stood slightly behind the driver's door, his body angled in the way they taught at the academy, ready for anything, expecting everything. The captain kept his voice steady and neutral. "No, officer, I don't." He noticed how the young officer's hand stayed near his holster, how his feet were planted just so, ready to move. The captain had taught these same techniques countless times at the academy. "We've had reports of suspicious vehicles in the area," the officer said, though no such reports had come through dispatch that night. "This is a quiet neighborhood, you understand. We like to keep it that way." The implications in his tone were clear as glass. Through his side mirror, the captain watched another patrol car slow down as it passed by. Word was probably already spreading on the private channels about a traffic stop in Oak Hills. The captain knew the statistics by heart. How many stops happened in this neighborhood? Who usually got pulled over? And more importantly, who didn't? "Can I see your license and registration?" The officer's flashlight beam never wavered, creating harsh shadows across the car's interior. The captain could feel the young officer's eyes tracking his every movement as he reached, slowly and deliberately, for his wallet. "My registration is in the glove compartment," the captain said calmly. "I'm going to reach over and get it now." He narrated each movement, just as he'd advised countless community members to do during his public safety workshops. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he moved, he caught a glimpse of the officer's nameplate in the mirror. The young man couldn't have been more than 25, probably fresh enough out of the academy to still remember all the textbook procedures, but not experienced enough to know when they were being misapplied. The leather of the captain's wallet felt worn and familiar in his hands. Inside, behind his driver's license, sat the gold badge that would soon change the entire dynamic of this encounter. But for now, he let the moment play out, gathering mental notes for the training reform proposal sitting in his briefcase. "Kind of late to be driving through here, isn't it?" The officer commented, his tone carrying an edge that had no place in professional police work. "Where are you headed?" The question came with an assumption of authority, of the right to know, of power dynamics that had no place in modern policing. The captain felt the weight of 20 years of service in his response. "I'm heading home from work," he said simply, knowing that sometimes the most powerful statements were the plainest ones. He could hear the radio chatter from the officer's shoulder unit. Another car was probably on its way as backup, standard procedure for traffic stops in this neighborhood. The whole scene was playing out exactly like the case studies in his presentation. The unnecessary backup calls, the tone, the assumptions. It was all textbook profiling, the kind of incident that ended up in sensitivity training videos. As he prepared to hand over his credentials, the captain wondered if this young officer had any idea he was about to become part of a much bigger conversation about change in the department. The young officer's flashlight beam bounced off the captain's hands as he carefully retrieved his license and registration. The night air had grown cooler, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, breaking the tense silence between them. A car passed by slowly, its headlights casting long shadows across the scene. Probably another patrol unit, drawn by the radio chatter about a stop in Oak Hills. "Nice car for its age," the officer commented, his tone dripping with unnecessary sarcasm. "Must take good care of it." He dragged out each word, making what should have been a compliment sound like an accusation. The captain had heard this tone before, had even addressed it in training sessions about professional conduct and community relations. "Thank you," the captain replied simply, his voice steady. "I believe in maintaining what I have." He could have mentioned that he bought the car when he made detective, or that it had carried him to countless crime scenes and community meetings over the years. But he kept those details to himself, watching the situation unfold like a textbook example of what needed to change. The officer's boots crunched on the gravel as he shifted his weight. "And what brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" The question came with an edge sharper than the evening breeze. "This is a private area. People here notice things that don't belong." The captain's phone continued recording silently in the cup holder, capturing every word. Tomorrow, this audio would become more than just evidence. It would be a teaching tool, a reality check for those who claimed these incidents were exaggerated or rare. "I'm coming from work," the captain repeated, noting how the officer's hand still hadn't left his holster. I was in a meeting that ran late. He kept his answers short and professional, just as he'd advised countless community members during safety workshops. The irony of following his own advice under these circumstances wasn't lost on him. A meeting. The officer's laugh was short and harsh. At this hour, in this neighborhood, each question came faster than the last, loaded with assumptions that had no place in professional police work. And what kind of meeting would that be? The captain could see a second patrol car pulling up in his side mirror, its headlights off, but emergency lights still spinning silently. Standard procedure for backup, though completely unnecessary for a simple traffic stop. He'd seen this pattern too many times in the statistics he reviewed each month. I've got my credentials right here, the captain said, slowly lifting the leather wallet that held both his license and his badge. He watched the officer's face in the mirror, knowing what was coming next. The moment stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. As the officer took the wallet, his flashlight illuminated the gold badge first. The change was instant, like someone had flipped a switch. The confident smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed recognition. The hand finally left the holster, dropping limply to his side. Sir, I didn't. The officer's voice had lost its edge, now stumbling over words that just moments ago had flowed so easily. The flashlight beam wavered, then dropped to the ground. In the distance, the backup unit's door opened and closed. Another officer responding to a scene that had just transformed completely. The captain sat quietly, letting the moment sink in. He thought about all the times he reviewed similar stops, all the complaints that crossed his desk, all the community meetings where people shared similar stories. Stories that didn't end with a badge reveal, stories that sometimes ended much worse. The radio on the officer's shoulder crackled with routine traffic, but the silence between them spoke volumes. The captain could already picture how this would play out in next week's training session. Not as a story of gotcha moments or punishment, but as a mirror for self-reflection, a chance for real change. This was the training moment he couldn't have planned better if he tried. Sometimes the best lessons came from unscripted moments like these, from real encounters that stripped away pretense and exposed the biases that still lingered in the system they were all working to improve. The silence that followed felt heavier than the badge in the young officer's trembling hands. Streetlights cast long shadows across his face, now drained of its previous confidence. The backup officer, who had been approaching from the second patrol car, stopped mid-stride, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. 20 years on the force, the captain said quietly, his voice carrying naturally in the still night air. And somehow, these stops never get easier. He wasn't just talking about being pulled over. He was talking about the weight of the moment, the responsibility that came with turning this incident into something meaningful. The young officer's hands lowered, and his flashlight beam pointed at the ground, creating a pool of light between them. From somewhere nearby, crickets chirped, seemingly unaware of the tension in this small patch of suburban street. A gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees lining the road, their leaves whispering above the idling engines of the patrol cars. "Sir, I apologize. I didn't realize." The officer's words tumbled out, each one tripping over the next. The captain noticed how his stance had changed. Gone was the aggressive posture, replaced by uncertainty. The backup officer had retreated to their car, presumably to radio in an update about the situation. "Put the flashlight away," the captain suggested gently. "Let's talk face to face." He kept his tone measured, professional, the same voice he used when mentoring new officers at the academy. This wasn't about shame or punishment. It was about growth. The beam clicked off, and for the first time, they could see each other clearly in the street lighting. The officer looked young, probably not much older than the captain's own son. His uniform was pressed perfectly, boots polished to a shine. Everything by the book, except for what mattered most. "Tell me," the captain began, still sitting calmly in his car, "what made you pull me over tonight?" He watched the officer's face carefully, noting every micro-expression. This was the moment that would define whether this became just another awkward encounter or a real opportunity for change. The silence stretched between them as the officer struggled to find words. In the distance, a helicopter's rotors thumped through the night sky, its searchlight sweeping across another part of the city. The sound faded, leaving them again with just the quiet hum of engines and the distant chorus of suburban nightlife. There were reports. The officer stopped, knowing his words rang hollow. There had been no reports, no calls, no legitimate reason for the stop. They both knew it, and now they both had to acknowledge it. Reports of what exactly? The captain's question was gentle but firm. He'd reviewed hundreds of incident reports over his career, had seen how often suspicious vehicle became code for something else entirely. The young officer's face flushed with understanding. The backup officer had stayed by their car, close enough to respond if needed, but far enough to give them privacy. They probably had their own radio calls to make now, their own explanations to give about how a routine traffic stop had turned into an encounter with a police captain. The captain glanced at his phone, still recording in the cup holder. Tomorrow, this recording wouldn't be used to file a complaint or demand punishment. Instead, it would become part of something larger, a teaching moment, a catalyst for the kind of honest conversations their department needed to have. I made an assumption, the officer finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, but also possibility. It was the kind of honest admission that couldn't be taught in any training manual or classroom session. The captain nodded slowly, appreciating the honesty. He'd seen too many similar situations end in defensive posturing or hollow excuses. But this officer's willingness to acknowledge his mistake opened the door for real learning, real change. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from moments like these, unplanned, uncomfortable, but undeniably real. "Let's walk through this together," the captain said, finally stepping out of his car. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving the young officer time to adjust to this new dynamic. The captain's suit jacket caught the breeze as he stood, his tie still loosened from a long day of meetings. Standing face to face under the streetlight, the height difference between them became apparent. The young officer was taller, but somehow seemed smaller now, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine reflection. The backup officer had disappeared into the shadows, giving them space while remaining present, a silent witness to what was unfolding. "Tell me about your patrol route tonight," the captain began, leaning slightly against his car. His voice carried the weight of experience, but also understanding. "How many stops have you made? What patterns have you noticed in your own decisions?" The night air had grown cooler, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly before fading into silence. The officer shifted his weight, his polished boots scraping against the asphalt. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet street, punctuating the heaviness of the moment. "I've made 8 stops tonight, sir," the officer replied, his voice steadier now, but humbler. He paused, and the captain could see the realization dawning on his face as he mentally reviewed those stops. Sometimes the hardest truths were the ones we had to discover for ourselves. "And if I pulled the data on those stops?" The captain's question was gentle but pointed. "What patterns would I find?" He watched as the officer's expression changed, understanding deepening into something more profound than simple embarrassment. A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across them before disappearing around the corner. In its wake, the silence between them grew more meaningful. The captain had given this lesson before, but never quite like this, never with such raw authenticity. "I knew this intersection had a history," the captain continued, gesturing to the quiet streets around them. "We've been tracking stop data here for months. Want to know what we found?" He reached back into his car, pulling out the briefcase he'd been planning to review at home. The papers inside rustled as he pulled out a folder, tomorrow's presentation materials. Under the streetlight, he showed the officer a graph, its bars telling a story that couldn't be ignored. Each of these represents a traffic stop at this intersection. Look at the patterns. What do you see? The young officer's eyes widened as he studied the numbers. Statistics that might have seemed abstract in a training room became painfully real when confronted with them here, at the scene of what would have been another tally mark on that same graph. I didn't. The officer started, then stopped, searching for words. I thought I was just doing my job, following my instincts. His voice carried a mix of defense and dawning awareness. Instincts can be trained, the captain replied, his tone encouraging rather than accusatory. That's what good policing is about. Questioning our assumptions, checking our biases, serving everyone equally. He closed the folder, but its impact lingered in the air between them. A light came on in one of the nearby houses, reminding them both that they were conducting this impromptu training session in the middle of a residential street. But some lessons couldn't wait for morning, couldn't be contained within classroom walls or training manuals. Tomorrow morning, the captain said, straightening his tie, I'm presenting these findings to the department. But tonight, you and I have a chance to be part of the solution instead of adding to the problem. He gestured to the quiet street around them. This isn't just about one stop, or one officer, or one captain. It's about changing a system, one interaction at a time. The officer's shoulders straightened slightly, not with the artificial authority from earlier, but with the posture of someone beginning to understand their role in something larger than themselves. Sometimes the best lessons came not from success, but from moments of uncomfortable truth. The sound of shuffling papers filled the night air as the captain pulled out another document from his briefcase. A moth fluttered around the streetlight above them, casting tiny dancing shadows on the graph-filled pages. The young officer's eyes were glued to the numbers, seeing his own actions reflected in the statistics before him. See this spot right here? The captain pointed to a particular intersection on the map. That's where we are now. Each dot represents a stop made in the last 6 months. His finger traced a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Notice anything unusual about the distribution. The officer's breath caught slightly as understanding dawned. The pattern was clear, too clear to be coincidence, too consistent to be random. His own stop tonight would have added another dot to that same telling cluster. A car alarm chirped in the distance as someone arrived home late, the sound breaking through their moment of reflection. The backup officer had retreated to their car completely now, perhaps sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a typical traffic stop resolution. I never thought. The young officer started, then paused, gathering his thoughts. In the academy, they taught us to look for suspicious behavior, but his voice trailed off as he struggled to reconcile his training with the reality before him. The captain nodded encouragingly. But suspicious is a subjective term, isn't it? What looks suspicious to one person might be completely normal to another. He pulled out another sheet, this one filled with community feedback. These are real statements from real people who live in this neighborhood. People who feel watched, targeted, unwelcome in their own community. The officer's eyes scanned the testimonies, his expression changing as he read. Each statement seemed to hit harder than the last, the words of residents describing experiences just like tonight's stop, except those stories didn't end with the captain's badge revealing itself. A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of a train whistle. The captain checked his watch. Nearly 10:30 p.m. now. His wife would be wondering why he was late, but some teaching moments were too important to rush. You know what the most interesting part is? The captain's voice was gentle but firm. This spot, this intersection, it's not random. Know why we've been monitoring it? He waited, letting the question hang in the air. The young officer shook his head, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine curiosity. The captain pointed to a nearby street sign, barely visible in the dim light. This is where 2 districts meet. Officers from both precincts patrolled here, making it perfect for our study. We've been tracking every stop, every interaction, looking for patterns we can learn from. Understanding flickered across the officer's face. So tonight's stop was exactly what we've been studying, the captain finished. But instead of being just another statistic, it can be something more. A turning point. He gathered the papers back into his briefcase, but left one sheet out, a blank incident report form. I could file this, the captain said, holding up the form. Add it to our data, make it official. Or, he paused, making sure he had the officer's full attention. We could use this moment differently. Turn it into something constructive. The officer straightened up slightly, his posture changing from defensive to attentive. What do you mean, sir? Tomorrow morning, I'm leading a training session on bias awareness and community policing. Real examples hit harder than theoretical ones. The captain's voice carried a note of possibility. Your experience tonight, your honest realization about your assumptions, that's more powerful than any textbook case study. The night had grown quieter, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how this moment would play out. Sometimes the best lessons weren't planned. They emerged from real moments of truth and understanding. The streetlight flickered briefly above them, drawing both men's attention upward for a moment. When they looked back at each other, something had shifted in the young officer's expression. The defensiveness was gone, replaced by a look of genuine interest and determination. You said tomorrow's training session. The officer's voice trailed off, then found its strength again. Sir, I'd like to be there, if that's possible. His words carried the weight of someone who had just discovered a new path forward. The captain smiled slightly, reaching into his jacket pocket for his phone. The recording was still running, capturing every word of their conversation. Actually, he said, stopping the recording with a quick tap, I think you could do more than just attend. A nearby house's motion sensor light clicked on as a cat darted across their front yard. In that brief extra illumination, the captain could see the mixture of surprise and uncertainty on the young officer's face. What exactly do you mean, sir? The captain leaned back against his car, his posture relaxed but professional. Every training session I've ever led has one major flaw. It's all theoretical. We show graphs, play recordings, share statistics. But nothing hits home like a real story, told by someone who lived it. The backup officer's car pulled away quietly, leaving them alone on the street. The sound of its engine faded into the night, replaced by the gentle rustle of oak leaves overhead. The weekend's forecast had predicted rain, but tonight the stars were clearly visible between the branches. You want me to? The officer paused, processing the suggestion. You want me to share what happened tonight? To talk about my own? He struggled with the word, finally settling on assumptions. Think about it, the captain said, his voice carrying years of experience. Which would impact you more? Hearing me lecture about bias in traffic stops, or hearing a fellow officer talk honestly about recognizing it in himself? A delivery truck rumbled past them, its headlights briefly illuminating the scene. In that flash of light, the captain could see the younger man's expression changing as he considered the possibility. Sometimes the best teachers were those who had just learned the lesson themselves. I wouldn't even know where to start, the officer admitted, his hand unconsciously adjusting his badge. The polished metal caught the streetlight, a reminder of the responsibility they both carried. The captain opened his briefcase again, this time pulling out a business card. Start with honesty, he said, handing over the card. That's all anyone can ask for. The training starts at 9 a.m. Come an hour early, and we'll work through how to present your experience. The officer took the card carefully, as if it carried more weight than its simple paper structure suggested. In many ways it did. It represented a choice between hiding from tonight's mistake or using it to help others avoid the same ones. Your supervisor needs to know about tonight, the captain continued, his tone firm but not harsh. But instead of filing a formal complaint, I'll be requesting your participation in our department's new community engagement initiative. Sometimes the best way to fix a problem is to put those who've recognized it in charge of solving it. A light drizzle began to fall, barely noticeable, but enough to create tiny halos around the streetlights. The captain glanced at his watch again. Nearly 11 p.m. now. His wife would definitely be wondering where he was, but some moments needed to play out fully. "You have a choice to make," the captain said, gathering his things. "You can view tonight as the worst traffic stop of your career, or you can see it as the moment that made you a better officer. Either way, what happens next is up to you." The young officer stood straighter, his earlier shame transformed into something more productive: determination. Sometimes the best lessons came wrapped in moments of discomfort, and the greatest growth emerged from our most challenging mistakes. 3 weeks had passed since that night at the intersection. The captain sat in his office, reviewing the latest batch of traffic stop data displayed on his computer screen. The numbers were starting to tell a different story, subtle changes that showed promise of real progress. The afternoon sun streamed through his window, casting warm light on a new addition to his wall. A framed graph showing traffic stop patterns before and after the new training program. The after section was still growing, but the trend was unmistakable. Red dots showing potentially biased stops had decreased by nearly 30%. A knock on his door drew his attention away from the screen. The young officer from that night stood in the doorway, holding a folder of his own. He looked different now, not just in his posture or expression, but in the way he carried himself. 3 weeks of leading morning briefings on bias awareness had changed him. "Sir, I have the latest community feedback reports," he said, stepping into the office. The folder he carried contained surveys from local residents, part of the new initiative to track not just the numbers, but the human impact of their changes. The captain gestured to a chair. "How was today's session?" He'd been hearing positive things about the officers' presentations, how his personal story was affecting other officers in ways that traditional training never could. "Better than expected," the officer replied, settling into the chair. "When I started talking about that night, about how sure I was that I was just doing my job." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I could see it clicking for some of them, the same way it clicked for me." Outside the office window, patrol cars came and went in the parking lot, their movements a steady rhythm of daily police work. But even that rhythm had changed. Officers were spending more time talking to community members, less time making unnecessary stops. "The stats back that up," the captain said, turning his monitor so the officer could see. "Look at the pattern around Oak Hills now." The cluster of dots that had once marked their fateful encounter had thinned considerably. The officer leaned forward, studying the screen. "These new patrol guidelines we implemented," he said, pointing to a particular area, "they're making a real difference. Officers are thinking twice, asking themselves the right questions before making stops." A group of recruits walked past the office, their voices carrying through the partially open door. They were discussing their morning session, the one where the young officer had shared his story. The captain caught fragments of their conversation, words like eye-opening and never thought about it that way. "You know what the best part is?" the officer said, pulling a letter from his folder. "This came in yesterday. It's from a resident in Oak Hills. They've noticed the change. Said they feel more comfortable in their own neighborhood now." The captain took the letter, reading it carefully. The words blurred slightly, not from the afternoon sun, but from the emotion they carried. Real change wasn't just about numbers on a screen or policies in a manual. It was about people feeling safe in their own communities. A text message buzzed on the captain's phone, his wife reminding him about dinner with their son tonight. He smiled, remembering how he told them about that night 3 weeks ago. His son had been proud, not just of the outcome, but of how his father had handled it. "We're presenting these results at next month's district meeting," the captain said, handing back the letter. "The chief wants to implement similar changes across all precincts. Your story will be part of that presentation." The officer nodded, understanding the responsibility that came with their success. "It's strange," he said, looking at the graph again. That night could have gone so differently. One complaint filed, one career damaged, nothing really changed. Instead, the captain finished, it became a catalyst. Sometimes the best changes start with one honest moment, one person willing to learn from their mistakes. The afternoon light caught the badge on his desk, a reminder of why they were both there. 6 months had passed since that night at the intersection. The police academy auditorium was packed with fresh-faced recruits, their uniforms crisp and new, their expressions eager to learn. The morning light streamed through high windows, creating bright paths through the slight haze of dust in the air. The captain stood at the side of the stage, watching as his once junior officer commanded the attention of every person in the room. The young man who had once profiled a police captain had become one of the department's most effective trainers on bias awareness and community policing. "I want to tell you about a traffic stop," the officer began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "One that changed not just my career, but my entire perspective on what it means to wear this badge." His hand unconsciously touched the polished metal on his chest. In the back of the room, community leaders sat watching. Residents who had volunteered to be part of the department's new training program. Among them was an elderly woman from Oak Hills who had written that first letter praising the changes in her neighborhood. "I thought I was doing my job that night," the officer continued, clicking through slides showing the intersection where it all began. "I had all the usual excuses ready: suspicious vehicle, unusual hour, wrong neighborhood." He paused, letting those words sink in. The captain noticed how the recruits leaned forward in their seats, caught up in the story. This wasn't just another training session with dry statistics and theoretical scenarios. This was real, raw, and relatable. "What I didn't know," the officer said, changing to a slide showing the traffic stop data, "was that I was about to become part of something bigger than myself. Something that would reshape not just our department, but departments across the state." A hand raised in the audience, a young recruit with questions in his eyes. "But how do we know when our instincts are right or wrong? When it's real suspicion versus," he struggled with the word. "Bias?" the officer finished for him. "That's exactly the question we need to ask ourselves. Every single time." He clicked to the next slide, showing the dramatic reduction in unnecessary stops over the past 6 months. The captain smiled, remembering how different things had been half a year ago. The department's complaint rates had dropped significantly. Community satisfaction scores had risen. Other precincts were now sending their officers to learn from their program. Outside, through the auditorium windows, patrol cars pulled in and out of the parking lot. Each one carried officers who had gone through this new training, who had heard this story, who were doing their jobs differently now. But the real change, the officer was saying, isn't in these numbers. It's in the conversations we're having. It's in the trust we're building. It's in knowing that every traffic stop could be a moment that either breaks or builds community trust. The elderly woman in the back dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have felt comfortable sitting in a room full of police officers. Now here she was, helping to train them. As the session wrapped up, recruits gathered around the officer, asking questions, sharing their own concerns and insights. The captain watched from the sidelines, seeing how one moment of truth had rippled out to touch countless lives. A text message buzzed in his pocket, his wife sending a photo of their dinner table, set for 4. The young officer would be joining them tonight, a tradition that had started 3 months ago. Sometimes the best partnerships grew from the most unexpected moments. "We're not perfect," the officer was telling the recruits, "but we're learning. And sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes." He caught the captain's eye across the room, sharing a moment of understanding. The morning sun had risen fully now, flooding the auditorium with light. Outside, the city was waking up to another day. A day that would be just a little bit better, a little bit fairer, because of one traffic stop that went right instead of wrong.